You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news, and we've had some good news this week in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Sam Fazeli, and my co-hosts today are Eric Schmidt, Paul Matteis, and Brian Skorney. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episodes, please go to biotechhangout.com. Now, it's been a pretty good week for biotech this week, and I've got just the right people to talk about it. Actually, I forgot to say we have Brad Loncar in too today, but someone needs to convert into a speaker. So that's perfect. We have a great lineup of stuff to talk about, which I'm going to state again. It's been a very positive week for biotech, even including some European names here, so which is great. Um, it's been a rare disease week, I would say, with positive data follow-ons, and of course, we had a dose of our usual obesity news with an M&A deal, etc. So, without further ado, I'm going to start talking about, some of the key deal that we saw today, this week, and that was announced on Merger Monday, I guess. That was Pfizer and Metsera, which is in the obesity space, and Pfizer paid a up to $7.3 billion for Metsera, which is a relative newcomer to the obesity space, with a GLP-1 in the clinic with a amyloid targeting drug also in the clinic. So I think my colleague Mike Shah's view on this was, and I'll very quickly go to the team to find out what their thinking is, that this was pretty much the better asset that perhaps Pfizer could have bought in the space, with the potential for the GLP-1 drug to be a monthly injection, which would be helpful and competitive. The data that we've seen so far is early, number of weeks in terms of weight loss, etc. It seems competitive, even as a single agent GLP-1 versus the tirzepatide and or Zepbound that we see from Lilly. And so, they've got something. They're back in the game in obesity after having had trouble with their danuglipron, their oral GLP-1s, and lotiglipron, etc. So it brings in a mid-stage GLP-1, MET097I, and the amylin, which is MET233I, both injections. But there's also some earlier stage products that they're working on in terms of orals. So that's the take that we had. We thought this was a good regaining of obesity relevance for Pfizer, but I'd love to hear from the others. So maybe we start off by just getting a thought from Eric here.
Yeah, Sam, I think you covered the Pfizer angle pretty well. Obviously, if a mid-cap biotech company can make a behemoth like Pfizer relevant again, that's saying a lot. I won't comment further, on how pharma might view this deal. But from a biotech perspective, this is a game changer in many ways. I mean, the first and most important way, obviously, is that, as you alluded to, Metsera just went public earlier this year. It was a relatively well received deal in a difficult market. They do have a full set of assets. My firm, Cantor, was involved with their IPO. My colleague, Prakar Agarwal, has been a huge advocate for the company since. But for a biotech company to, not only be well received in a pretty difficult climate, but just 6 to 9 months later, be acquired for more than 100% premium after, again, a pretty well-received debut on the public markets. The stock did well during and through the IPO, and now is been acquired at a significant premium. So that's something we just haven't seen in a long time. I can't remember a biotech IPO that was up within 6 to 9 months of its IPO. Maybe the others can on this call, and a good premium to boot, and one of the few IPOs this year. So I think what we're seeing this week and through the last couple months is just really much more optimism and interest and investing activity in mid-cap biotech. You're going to allude to all the deal flows that were also announced this week from a secondary offering perspective. But yeah, I'm pretty pumped, and I guess I second Brian's thoughts at the outset of the call. But what do you guys think?
I mean, on
Well,
the sentiment side, Eric, like I don't want to take too big of a tangent and we can talk about data later, but you know, looking at like the UniQure stock move this week, the MBX stock move this week, the Rapport stock move last week, I'm sure I'm missing others. One investor said to me, I didn't know these stocks could move that much, right? Just in the sense of like thinking about the risk reward and what the up down was on the UniQure data, which looked like it was really great data and maybe a best case scenario. But I think that is one thing where at least what we're hearing from people are what are the next small caps, right? With data readouts where people were previously kind of thinking their null hypothesis was that the data wasn't de-risking, but maybe now the market is just kind of viewing even, and I want to say the UniQure event was incremental because it wasn't. It was much bigger than incremental. But, maybe even some of these earlier stage data sets could move stocks more than we thought and lead to successful financings. And, I guess what I'm trying to say is it just seems like people view the risk reward for the sector as fundamentally changing.
And I'll just jump in and echo what you said, Sam. I think this was a really smart acquisition by Pfizer. And Metsera is a really unique asset because for Pfizer, this is kind of like buying an obesity toolbox rather than buying a single asset. Like other companies like Roche have had to do all these piecemeal acquisitions. But the unique thing about this is like a lot of, however the obesity field changes over time, and it will change over time, there's a high likelihood that Metsera will have something in the toolbox to be at the forefront of it. So they have this unique dosing for their GLP, which is differentiated, but they also have a great amylin program in case amylin, starts driving to the forefront. They also, as you said, on an earlier stage, they're working on orals. They have both small molecule orals and oral peptides. I've actually visited the company in Korea that's helping them with their oral peptides. And so I think this is a space that every big company needs to be in, and you can't afford to place a bet today and have this field change over the next 5 or 10 years or over however long and find out that you placed the wrong bet. So something new could happen that maybe isn't a part of this package, but the chances of Pfizer succeeding over the long term are high because this is such a diverse company. And the last thing I'll say is if I saw any bearish arguments about this, like I saw some Twitter comments of like, well, Pfizer's too late, this isn't going to succeed, like all of this stuff, like they're too late in the game. And I think that GLPs are going to be with us forever. And for a large company like Pfizer, I don't think I think it's inning one of this, and I don't think they're late at all. And I think this will end up being a field like the statin field over time that's so important that there's going to be many of these drugs on the market, and you don't necessarily have to have been the first or second company to succeed over the coming decades.
yeah, I mean, look, some of the data there's a slew of data still to come, and they've got the as I'm looking here at the news flow, and a whole lot of it's coming in 2025. One assumes that Pfizer's had a look at something, although of course the company can't have stock moving data in hand that it hasn't shared with the market, but I'm pretty sure that the company's done its due diligence. And there's, of course, always with these drugs, as you know, you have to watch out for that balance of efficacy versus side effects. You can always get enormous efficacy at the cost, right? So there are some possible questions in there as to vomiting rates, etc. But these are early stage dose escalating trials, and there's plenty of data to come. Look, and again, we look at the amylin, it looks competitive. We look at the GLP-1, it looks competitive. We don't know what the orals look like, but time will tell. So it's a good entry, and I'm sure, Brad, if you went and added up the amounts that Roche perhaps paid for Carmot plus the deal with Zealand plus whatever they've obviously 89 Bio is in the MASH space, but it probably doesn't look that different to what Pfizer just paid. So we can try and do valuation analysis on this, which is kind of pointless because it all depends on where the whole story ends up. So, but again, great start on a Monday, and congratulations to the management team. Of course, only last week, or was it the week before, we had John Maraganora on talking about the company they've started, I think Coursera, with Clive Meanwell. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch going forward with the ideas that they've got. Right. Did anybody else wanted to comment here? I mean, we had Roche talk about obesity on their Pharma Day, but really it was just a nice way of them showing us how the whole market is segmented. It's not just a simple you go to the doctor and you sell them a drug and the patient takes it. It's much more complicated than that. But aside from that, if we're all good, I'd love to move on to we talk about the fundraisings that each of these companies have had, but move on to data. And I'm going to change the order from what we talked about. UniQure, I think we're going to have to talk about that first because it's an awful disease, first time in, interesting setup here with the stereotactic gene therapy. So we're going to start with Paul just to tell us, set the scene up here. What happened, what created that, for want of a better phrase, hockey stick in the share price.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, I think look at the stock move, right? There was still a lot of skepticism here on how these 3-year data would look. And I think there's been just a lot of broader questions in the investor community around, many gene therapy and rare companies have these seemingly handshake or written agreements around a flexible regulatory path. But I still think and a lot of investors have wanted to see it to believe it, given the kind of volatility we've seen at the FDA. But, this UniQure program for Huntington, so it's a gene therapy that seeks to silence mutant Huntington, which is the bad actor in the disease, we believe, because it's an autosomal dominant disease. And, this program's been in development for a long time. Huntington's is a really, really tough area for drug development. There was a big setback in the field that diminished a lot of the investor enthusiasm for UniQure and others. That setback was from Roche and Ionis for their ASO program that ended up having a tox issue and failed in phase 3. And for UniQure, one of the challenges that they deliver this directly into the deep brain, which is likely the right area, right? That's the core site of pathology. But because of that, it's been difficult to generate interpretable biomarker data because when you look at Huntington protein levels in the CSF, that might not actually be emblematic of where this gene therapy has been going. So UniQure has been kind of generating data over time where they've been following these patients for longer and longer. And they had some 2-year data last year that showed significantly less disease slowing than natural history. But I think, 2 years wasn't seen as long enough because at 1 year, the placebo arm in UniQure's trial hadn't really declined all that much either. So going into these data, what we knew was that UniQure had breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA on the 2-year data. They had an SAP agreed upon with the FDA to compare the 3-year data with a natural history control arm. And, we were getting a lot of questions on what's the bar. And I think our view on the bar was that if it's something within the margin of the 2-year data, well, that should be very good, right? Because they already got breakthrough on the 2-year data. And so the data itself came in, I would say, better or above expectations because it was essentially the same disease slowing at the 2-year data. And they also showed clinical benefit on a secondary endpoint, TFC, total functional capacity, which was a bonus because this is viewed as a harder measure. And it's also a measure that the FDA has recommended to another sponsor for full approval. So these guys will be filing in the first quarter of next year after meeting with the FDA one more time. I think the data look good enough, right? And Huntington's is such a severe and terrible disease that I think the broad expectation is this will likely attain approval. And now the investment conversation and the forecasting conversation centers around, what will commercial uptake look like? I mean, I think it's pretty clear cut that the demand is going to be very high. But this is a cumbersome product to use. It's brain surgery. I don't think the brain surgery is that complicated, but it's a long procedure. It's essentially a full day. We feel comfortable that this is Huntington's, right? People are going to want it. Physicians will figure out how to use it. But, that'll be the question, right? What does the launch ramp look like? But overall, huge success for a company that's been at this for a very long time. Anyone else following this closely?
Yeah, Brian, did you want to say here anything? You've often been.
I thought there was more questions still on regulatory, just that it is gene therapy. It's a Vinay Prasad center, and there's sort of been, and we've talked about this a lot, right? Like Vinay what his attitude is on single arm pivotal studies, what his attitude is on gene therapy in single arm pivotal studies, and whether or not he has any political capital in his return or not. So, I think that's kind of the big question mark. What would the Vinay Prasad of Twitter before he went over to the FDA, what would he say about this data, and how much of sort of his prior hypothesis on these types of studies would apply to his role at CBER, but also his role at CBER after getting fired and then getting brought back.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's Skorney. It's like, it's a great point, right? I mean, this is ultimately like, I think the biggest risk here, right, is just, this FDA has been difficult to predict, to say the least, right? You have all the history of Dr. Prasad online. I mean, I will say a couple things, and again, I would love to hear how other people are kind of interpreting these sort of these types of data points. But we saw the approval of the Stealth Biosciences product recently, right, which was a product that's been in front of the FDA on and off for a long time, and it getting through, it feels like it's a benchmark of increasing regulatory flexibility. And then we also got, just around this UniQure data release, a draft guidance from FDA around cell and gene therapy products in small populations that talks about externally controlled studies, and sounds a lot like the UniQure regulatory agreement. So, I mean, I think like it feels like a lot of the tea leaves are favorable. And I guess our view is that, if you're the FDA and you're looking at these different rare diseases and where are you going to be flexible and where are you going to have higher risk tolerance versus lower risk tolerance. I mean, I would just point out that like Huntington's it's predominantly an adult population, right? Where I think the risk piece, maybe you're a little bit more risk tolerant. And it's a disease that's got nothing disease modifying. I mean, we feel like if they're not going to be risk tolerant here, that would be somewhat discouraging for the space.
So could it even? uh, I mean, they started doing a sham control arm, right? What happened there? Why did that not continue
Yeah,
to
it's a good
to
question. I
happen?
mean, they basically like, so I think the difficulty in these neurodegenerative studies, right, is like, when do you intervene? Um, and we know that in a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases, by the time a patient is diagnosed, there's been like massive brain volume loss, right? I mean, in Parkinson's, people have lost 70% of the putamen or striatum before they're even diagnosed. So this was even more of a salient question with a gene therapy, right? Because not only do you want to have preserved brain volume for benefit, you also want to have preserved brain volume to actually have the procedure be successful, right? To actually have the product transduce neurons. So they went after an early stage population, and their control arm at year one clinically like really didn't decline, And so, but then at some point, right, you kind of need to have patients who get the sham be allowed to actually get the gene therapy product. So I'm not by any means like belittling this, right? Like the reality is this didn't clearly clinically separate from placebo when they had a placebo arm. But at the same time, like, is it realistic to run a 3-year placebo controlled study in Huntington's where you have a sham surgery? I mean, that's also a lot to ask of patients too. So that's the context there.
Yeah. And then what happens next? Let's say this is approved. How does anybody come in and do another trial? I mean, that shouldn't be a reason why a drug shouldn't be approved if it's working, right? But if you've
That's a
got
good
a product
question.
that requires surgery, etc.,
Yeah,
how do you set up a control arm?
I'm less worried about that, to be honest. I mean, I think the UniQure product will be a commercial success if it is approved. But I mean, if you do the math, right, and you say there's 50 centers that could give this in a reasonable period of time, and this is, again, we're talking brain surgery, right? So let's say those centers can do a couple patients a week, right? Just rough math. I mean, if you multiply that capacity, you're talking about 2,500 patients a year. I mean, if UniQure treated that many patients a year, I mean, I think that would be a very, very successful commercial outcome. And I think it will take significant time to get to that level. I mean, look, I would love to be wrong, but just, again, we've seen these complicated products, right, can take some time to ramp up. And so, 2,500 divided by 30,000 patients in Huntington's, I still think there's going to be a way for others to develop other treatments. I don't think it's going to bar anybody.
Yeah, yeah. So look, the stock's trading now on an enterprise value of something in the region of $3 billion. I just wanted, I think this is another element. The reason I wanted to start with UniQure is because in 2023, I think the company was left for dead. It was trading on a negative enterprise value. So it just shows how biotech works and how you just can't, it must so difficult and so complicated to make a decision with regards to an investment based on what you see on the market, because that would have told you, well, nobody believes in this anymore. Let's just move on. So I just wondered if anybody wanted to make a comment on that before we move on to Brian to talk about Soleno and Acadia. No, you don't want to celebrate that? That we can get a company coming back from what looks like for dead? Fair enough. Brian, over to you. Yeah.
But well,
High five.
I mean, I guess I would just say before I start on sort of the Acadia Soleno PWS thing, I would say it's not unique, and that's the selling point. When the XBI is way down, it's a selling point when the XBI is way up. I mean, there's never been a year I can remember where a company hasn't transitioned from negative EV to up hundreds of %, and some of the biggest companies ever have been there, right? Like Pharmacyclics was left for dead, and then it was one of the biggest acquisitions of a commercial entity in history. So another example of that is actually Soleno Therapeutics. Soleno was left for dead at basically a zero EV, going back just only about 2.5 years ago, and then has the first approved PWS drug for hypophagia. The news in that space this week was Acadia had a phase 3 study readout earlier this week. It wound up failing. It was intranasal carbetocin. They had some prior clinical data indicating there might be some effect here. There was there's a lot of skepticism that this was going to be a positive readout to begin with, but certainly from the Soleno perspective, I think people were worried that in addition to the Scorpion report that has come out that's been putting a lot of pressure on the stock over some perception of safety events maybe being different than what the expectation was going to be. I think a lot of investors saw the Acadia readout as a potential, even if it was a low probability, potentially very, very bad additional weight on Soleno. So saw Soleno trade up significantly on the Acadia failure here. Sounds like there really wasn't much here. They said that Acadia said they're going to discontinue it. So for now, Soleno remains the only approved drug for the treatment of hyperphagia in PWS. And so far it's been doing very well. It had a great quarter, second quarter, and now all eyes are kind of moving on to third quarter and whether or not some of the assertions in the Scorpion report are going to weigh down the numbers in third quarter, or whether they'll continue to show a really great trajectory.
Skorney, is the rhythm data at all an overhang for Soleno, or are people more willing to say, you know what, it's only a phase 1-2 study, it's open label?
Yeah, I think people are much less worried about that being an issue. It's phase 1-2 open label. They still have a long way to go, even if it is something that looks positive and favorable. And I think there's been a history of like early studies in PWS showing some modest effect size not translating in larger studies. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on. But I think just given the sort of near-term potential that intranasal carbetocin could potentially have had to come into the market while there's sort of this overhang on safety made it a much bigger issue than what the rhythm data will have.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so while you guys at it, maybe you could just talk about, I remember it was about 6 months or 9 months ago, we were talking about the Soleno data approval, etc. Do you guys want to just talk about how the drug's actually doing in the market? Vicat, was it
Yeah, so
one
I
of
said,
those
I mean, it did
successes?
really good. It had a fantastic first full quarter of launch. The company was able to do a raise on the back of pre-announcing that number. So, for all people kind of comp it to Reata / Biogen's Skyclarys as an indication they're similar sizes, similar kind of view of uncertainty of how robust the efficacy is. But, is doing better than Skyclarys did at the outset. I think a lot of people right now, even though they had a fantastic 2Q because of sort of the short report concerns, everyone is, now we're getting like a ton of questions on like, oh, what's the bogey for 2Q? Do they have to do, mid 60s? Do they have to do 70 million, which would be over double what 2Q is, or, is just showing kind of continued consistent growth good at this point because of the concerns over, the perceived concerns over safety. But so far, all of the data on VYKAT has been really good on the commercial launch. We had a survey note out last week. We've done a number of doc calls that are publicly available over the last couple of weeks, and it sounds like it continues to have high robust demand, and nothing to really speak of in terms of discontinuations being outside of expectations.
Right. If nobody else wants to comment on this, I'll move on to the stealth biosciences. You did mention that earlier, Paul. Just tell us a little bit about this Barth syndrome and what this drug is about, because it's been
Yeah,
around a
I mean,
while, this story, right?
I think the story here to me is like more about just reading the tea leaves in the FDA and sort of what Skorney was talking about. Like, I think the $1 million question for investors right now is like, is the FDA going to actually be as flexible in rare disease, and oncology is a separate question that others, Eric, might have more of a strong view on, like, as I think be as flexible as they seem to be telling a lot of companies, right? And so I'm not overwhelmingly close to this drug, but it's been around for a long time. And there had been some, and I don't know how impactful this was, but there had seemingly been some political pressure around it, right? I mean, it was mentioned, I think, in one or two Wall Street Journal articles that were critical of the FDA. Again, might be totally unrelated to the actual decision to approve it, but the drug getting approved on not a perfect data set, feels like it's a positive for the space. And to me, again, every approval and every indication, right, has like its own idiosyncrasies, but I think, if again we just go back to the UniQure stock reaction, right? Because Brian's points on Vinay Prasad, what's the FDA going to do? I mean, they're all like really good points, and I think that they're like a valid bear case. But it feels like even in just the past week, there's this subtle tide turning, right? You had that approval, you had these gene therapy guidelines come out that read very, very similarly to what companies have been telling investors, and many investors kind of discounting. And so I just think it's, to me, it's like it's another push in the direction that, maybe this agency in the rare space looks more like Peter Marks than not. That was my conclusion.
Maybe I just jump in. I do. I mean, I do follow stealth pretty closely because, in particular, it's kind of related to one of my other names under coverage, Biohaven, which has a very similar application, I would argue, under review at the FDA. And I guess, I've said this before. I think like we have a tendency to kind of view FDA as a monolith and say, oh, is the FDA becoming more flexible or less flexible? And, what I always try to really focus on is like, who's the person who signs an NDA or a complete response letter? What is that person going to do? Are they going to accept like the review team decision? Do they normally go a different route than the review team? And who are their bosses, right? So I kind of brought up on UniQure, right? Like it is Vinay Prasad, but Vinay clearly has bosses who have taken some wind out of his sails, at least over some of the back and forth with Sarepta, right? This is a little bit different. The Stealth Biosciences is the Center for Neuroscience, so it is CDER, so it is technically George Tidmarsh. And to your point, Paul, I mean, there's been a lot of pushback on this review specifically, and I definitely think that there was some political pressure to get this approved here. And it'll be interesting to see when the full NDA review is posted. Who was voting in favor on the review division, who was voting against. But it has a strange history in that they did a phase 3 study. It did not hit the primary endpoint, and it really wasn't close on a p-value. I think it was like a 0.94 p-value, so really no separation. Very high probability of just random noise there, and they did this multiple year open label study and have done a natural history comparison. It went before an AdCom. The AdCom voted in favor of approval, and it got the PDUFA got delayed, and then it wound up getting rejected, and then they wound up resubmitting for it. So there's definitely been a lot of back and forth here, and it is, I agree, a very, very interesting application that's been kind of under the radar, just because it is not a very public company. Was taken private maybe 2 years ago. So but definitely sort of has a lot of implications to how we think about CDER, and broader FDA, and sort of the ability to maybe use advocacy groups and political pressure to reverse review team decisions.
Brian, I mean, Prasad is chief medical officer again. Like, don't you feel like even though these are CDER, they still have some broader read through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he has. So the question is, yes, he is CMO, but I think like CMO decisions at FDA, there's not a lot of times I've seen them be like an integral determinant of a review decision, right? They sort of provide high level input. They certainly, if there's a leadership vote on things, like the CMO will participate in that sort of dynamic. But again, it's kind of like it is what the FDA commissioner allows it to be. And I guess I would be very skeptical that Vinay's position as CMO of the FDA would overrule or be taken above George Tidmarsh's view as the director of CDER, right? CDER directorship is generally a more influential position, even if on the organizational chart, maybe CMO is technically more to the right and above CDER decision. So I would be surprised if he had a ton of input on sort of the Stealth Biosciences review. But I could be wrong. I can't wait to see the NDA when it gets.
It looks like Brian thinks that the FDA is still functioning as a normal organization would, and I'm hoping that is the case. And we've just had another positive thing from the FDA this week for Cidara Therapeutics. And Eric, do you want to talk to us about that? Another company that phoenix from the ashes. I love these stories.
Well, that's a good point, Sam. Yeah, I mean, Paul got to talk about his UniQure, and Brian his Soleno, and I guess this is my multi-bagger. Cidara has been a terrific story this year. It's gone from about $20 to $80 a share, and yeah, it's for great reason. These guys have wonderful phase 2b data for a drug called CD388, which is an influenza prophylaxis. It's probably about 2 times more effective than the flu at preventing seasonal influenza. And what maybe really appeals to this FDA, certainly to the MAHA contingent, is that it is not a vaccine. It's a antibody conjugated to an old antiviral. I know you're familiar with the drug Relenza from your past life, Sam. So amazing that this works. What happened this week was that they were essentially not only given a green light to proceed with a single additional trial to support approval, a single phase 3 required, but also that the FDA maybe seemingly encouraged or agreed or aligned with them on introducing a potentially even broader patient population into the mix. Not just those who are elderly and immunocompromised or elderly and have other risk factors, but also those who are just elderly. Being over the age of 65 itself is a risk factor for influenza. So their study will enroll elderly patients as well as elderly with other risk factors. And if positive, which I certainly expect it to read out favorably, this could open up a market of over 100 million Americans. So big drug, big indication, probably too small a company to maximize the value here. I've got to think there's going to be a lot of pharma interest in this asset, especially as it's now, within a year of having phase 3 data in hand to file on. With regard to the FDA, guys, I'm going to take kind of the other side of the equation here. I think what you were all talking about with both UniQure and Stealth are top-down approvals, at the top of the agency. I do think there is an agenda to try and be more favorably inclined toward orphan disease drugs, more favorably inclined toward faster approvals, more efficient processes. But I got to say, I'm also looking at things like Scholar Rock and Biogen this week, which kind of received somewhat needless CRLs for minor manufacturing issues. Maybe these are bottoms-up concerns where the review teams, or in this case, the CMC teams, just didn't get their stuff done in time. But to me, this is a very worrisome trend that we're seeing. We may be actually seeing some cracks in the armor, some inability to function at the agency, given all the turmoil, all the turnover, all the cultural issues that we know are underfoot here. So where I'd love to be optimistic and believe that coming from the top down, a broader policy and a broader agenda can be helpful to biotech. I am really worried that we're also just not getting the work done. But I'll throw that out to the team.
Yeah,
I know it's
let's get back to that in a minute because we've got a whole bunch of other relevant equivalent stuff to talk about. And Eric, with regards to how much of this story of Cidara do you think is to do with the reality of the value of this asset than the reality of what the world is becoming, which is not just a US issue. If you go by measles cases in terms of a way of gauging how anti-vaccine the world has become, Canada's in an awful place in terms of percentage of population. Switzerland the same, UK the same, probably several European countries that I haven't looked at. Is this as much about this is a good drug as the world is going to need something like this if it's going to be with this attitude against vaccines, etc.?
Well, I mean, just putting aside the anti-vaccine sentiment that's out there, the drug itself is a terrific product. At least in the first phase 2B or 3 trial, it prevented about 75% of influenza infections. And it did that without needing to be matched for the seasonal strains that might be circulating at the time. As you well know, Sam, it's a real problem in influenza vaccination production to anticipate what might be out there. And sometimes we don't get it right. And sometimes the strains are mismatched. In any normal year, I think the influenza vaccine is about 40-ish% effective, ballpark. There are good years and bad years, but we were talking about 2x the protection levels. So when you think about the burden of this disease on society, all the hospitalizations, all the deaths, about 80,000 deaths per year in the US, yeah, this has real value in any societal frame of mind that we might be in.
Well, let's hope it gets priced in a way that people can actually access it. Unlike the, I'm sorry, I'm still burning a little bit from last week's conversation about the TAR 200 pricing for Johnson & Johnson's NMIBC drug. I remember Josh was talking about it's a great drug, but $700,000 for a drug-eluting device. It was shocking to me, and I hope that at the end of the day, I know that other countries have to pay more for their drugs, but some stories just baffle me sometimes in terms of the prices that people come up with. Anyway, let's not go there. Let's keep talking about data. And we did obviously have the MBX data in chronic hypoparathyroidism. So, Paul, do you want to touch on that before we go back to Brian and talk about PepGen and then move on to our politics and other bad stuff?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to comment briefly on PepGen too. Brian and I both follow this DM1 space closely. I mean, really quickly on MBX, they had phase 2 data in their trial looking at their once weekly product for hypoparathyroidism. I think my colleague Annabelle covers the stock, but I followed this category for a while. I used to cover NPS Pharma, who had the first hormone replacement here. That was an interesting product, but not a perfect product. And I mean, the challenge in this disease is really just kind of getting the exposure right? And I think that was one of the sources of skepticism going into this data was, could the once weekly data be messy? How is this going to kind of coexist with titrating other things like calcium? And, you go back to the original data for Natpara and this indication. I mean, Natpara got approved and it met its primary endpoint, but there were higher rates of, hypocalcemia, I think hyper at least versus on that drug versus placebo, right? So it just kind of gets at the challenge of the exposure equation here. And their data looks very positive, showing that this is a viable approach. I mean, over 60% of patients attain serum calcium normalization with independence from vitamin D supplementation. So I think ultimately it looks encouraging. I mean, I think there's some discussion around a higher placebo effect in this study, and the fact that again, Yorvipath from Ascendis is is the incumbent product. It certainly doesn't set a low bar, right? But looks like a promising outcome. The stock reacted well. Another good example in small biotech, right, of a company who has some data, stock reacts really well, able to successfully finance.
Brian, did you want to add anything?
No, not on the MBX side, but I'll just jump in with the PepGen data, and Paul, feel free to jump into. So PepGen announced results from a single arm dose study on Wednesday in DM1 patients. I'm in the space covering Dyne, and PepGen showed at their 15 mg per kg dose, they showed a 53.7 mean splicing correction. So splicing correction, the underlying issues in this disease is missplicing. There is a biomarker measuring splicing correction that these companies are using. It's a little more debated as to how relevant it is. Certainly versus like dystrophin or something with that's a pure monogenic protein replacement therapy. There are a number of programs further ahead in development. Again, Dyne and Avidity are both in pivotal studies, but the splice correction here looks substantially higher than what we've seen from the later stage programs. I think Dyne has shown about half of that. Avidity has shown lower than Dyne and sort of less consistent. And as I said, the FDA hasn't exactly bought into splice correction as an approvable endpoint yet. I think Dyne was trying to negotiate with them on that point, but wound up under some controversy going with VHOT, which is sort of viewed as maybe more of an intermediate clinical endpoint. But the PepGen data definitely put them on the map. Talking about financing, they wound up doing a $100 million deal, was priced at 320. And wound up immediately doubling. So anyone who participated in this deal was up 100% right off the deal. It's trading down today, but it's still touching $5. So way up. And another clear example of sort of positive news in the space, getting rewarded not just with a financing, but a lot of upside, including the financing. I think a little bit of the controversy here is peptide conjugation of oligos, which is sort of what PepGen's doing here, has had a little bit of a mixed safety history around concerns of renal tox. Sarepta last year canceled their PPMO program in DMD following some evidence of renal impact. PepGen's own DMD program has been shelved over lack of efficacy at the doses they've tested, but there's been some question as to whether or not going higher would lead to any renal toxicity. So that seems to be the overarching concern here, and why the stock still trades at a very significant discount to the leaders here. But it'll be interesting to see. They're in a multiple ascending dose study right now. So I think that's where investors' eyes are really turned on this story. Paul, I don't know if you had any.
I mean, I agree with all that, man. That was great. I mean, I think safety, there's some preclinical data. Some of this early clinical data suggests that this DM1 program has a wider, well, not just a wider therapeutic index, but even dose for dose, a cleaner safety profile. But certainly we need the MAD data to confirm that or not.
Well, mad or not, I tell you, it's a phenomenal week that we can talk about so many positive outcomes. And I just want to highlight that we talk about share prices doubling and tripling and etc. But the reality here is that these are drugs that are going to make a difference, fingers crossed, to people's lives at the end of the day. I had a friend who unfortunately passed away from Huntington's. And it is heartwarming to think that we're actually involved in a sector that does that. So, I mean, let's all make sure that we don't lose sight of that aspect of it, which is critical. Just before we move on and talk about the policy, politics, and other bad stuff, which is, I love that little headline that I don't know who wrote it. Maybe we wrote it all together. So let's, I think we touched enough about the CRL for Scholar Rock and Biogen. And how much of this is to do with we remember we've also got Regeneron recently and Rare that had an issue recently. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this? Is there a lot more? Is there something going on underneath here that CRLs are used for just getting things put off for a while? Is there any other angle?
I just hear that it's all Catalent's fault, even if Catalent's not.
But that's Novo now, right?
I just hear it's their fault.
That's all Novo now, right? Is it all Novo now? I'm wondering how the due diligence went when they were doing all that. So all Catalent's fault. Okay, well, that's also easy to point fingers, but nevertheless,
Yeah, but the Biogen and Ultragenyx news that you mentioned, Sam, that's not Catalent, right? So that's other FDA sites. You guys have all heard Emil Kakkis, the CEO of Ultragenyx, talk about his inspection and how he felt very strongly, obviously, that he wasn't getting a fair shake with the FDA. Brian and Paul, I don't know if you had a chance to chat with Biogen, but they obviously this week felt quite strongly also that their inspection or their CRL for CMC issues was not just. They believe they have everything they need to resubmit immediately, and basically the FDA just didn't do its job. So at least that was my take on what they told us. And again, I think this isn't necessarily a surprise given everything we know about the agency, but I'd be very interested to hear others' opinions on how they think the agency performance is trending from the ground level up, not
Yeah,
top down.
the Catalan thing was a joke. I just think it's like the scapegoat of the day for a lot of these companies. No, I totally agree. I didn't want to paint the picture that I think the FDA is functioning normally at all. I think they are not functioning normally at all, and I think what we've been saying for the whole year, to expect just inconsistency. And there are some things that are going to be exhibition of the FDA being extraordinarily flexible to like an extent that we've never seen before. And there's other areas where it's just not going to be something that rises to the level of, leadership caring at all. And it's just going to fall by the wayside because of the chaos and turnover within the agency that's occurring.
Just while we're talking about the agency, they recently approved or suggested that a drug be used for autism. Um, I just wanted to know other people. I mean, I'm sitting here pretty much baffled by that decision without any meaningful data support, any conversation. Anybody want to talk about that? This is the Replimune approval for a form of autism. Are you?
You mean the
Sorry,
Leucovorin
yes.
approval,
Yeah.
Sam?
Yeah,
GSK.
Leucovorin.
Well, this is a bit of a third rail for me, but I'll touch it and start off the conversation. I mean, anyone who listened into the Trump press conference on, I guess it was Monday or Tuesday this week, on not just the link between Tylenol, or the supposed link between Tylenol and autism, but also Trump's view that the vaccine schedule needs to be changed and that vaccines are harmful. I mean, he was basically singing a page right out of the RFK Jr. MAHA songbook, and that page had very, very little basis in science. So, to me, that was a new public low for our healthcare leaders when it comes to public policy. I guess I was honestly most perturbed by the fact that the supposed scientists in the room, and you had all of them, Dr. Oz, Dr. Bhattacharya, and Dr. Makary, went along with the script and even, took it to another level. Dr. Makary, in terms of his interest in approving leucovorin based on non-scientific fact, and also putting out warnings that mothers and children and others should not use Tylenol because of this potential link, which again, I think the media did a great job of debunking in about 30 minutes time. So yeah, sad in my opinion, and just something we have to live with for the time being.
I think it's, and I, I mean, I'm a critic. I'm a bipartisan critic, and I think I've been as critical as sort of the players in the Biden administration, whether it be Metsera or Califf or Fauci, as I'll be with sort of Trump and RFK Jr. here. But to me, what bothers me across everything is just sort of the cognitive dissonance, and I think this press conference is a really good example, because you're holding Tylenol to one set of data, and then you're holding leucovorin to another set of data, and you can say that there in this one study there was an association with acetaminophen and increase in autism when taken prenatally, but it's very, very weak evidence. And I think certainly leucovorin outside of like cerebral folate deficiency is also like really, really weak evidence. So how you sort of trump one thing on really weak evidence as being great, and really knocking on acetaminophen over this weak evidence as being really bad. I think it's just a weird dynamic to set up, and I think certainly it's interesting to try to make acetaminophen into a bad guy. I don't think there's no such thing as like big Tylenol at this point. It's just so widely availably generic. But the messaging there has been pretty bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, Kenvue's share price got, or at least there are the risks that, I mean, we've had so many questions on that. What does this mean for them? And of course, I don't know where the opportunities now rise for just about anybody who has any issues with a problem with in pregnancy or an autistic child, which is an awful thing to have. Well, maybe not an awful thing to have. I mean, this is humankind at the end of the day. But at the end, does that open them up to endless lawsuits, given the amount of attention that this has got? And how do you deal with that? Can they sue the administration for lack of proof, data, etc.? I don't know. I mean, it is a very difficult subject to talk about because I think we all worry about getting into hot water with them, especially when it comes to legal issues. But at the end of the day, it's very emotive. I have autistic relatives, etc. They're just as important in the fabric of life as everybody else. So I just don't know how you close this conversation in terms of what do you do with this information now. And I'm glad that they didn't directly link just about every vaccine that exists to autism. But honestly, I started doing a little experiment of taking a whole bunch of stuff that you could put on a chart and show a very nice R-squared correlation between their introduction. One of the ones, what was it? It was corn syrup and the rise in autism. And there's actually some scientific evidence that it impacts neuronal development. So difficult and complicated space here. So
Can I
yeah. Oh
can
yes,
I
please.
jump in and just offer a different view, partly for the sake of it? And look, there's this whole issue, like everything about this. And first of all, I've never looked at leucovorin, and that sounds crazy to me. But I do want to talk about this in the context of the Tylenol angle to it, and a broader discussion about how things like this affect our industry, which I think are really important. Um, so this whole episode to me is emblematic of a couple things that I really worry about a lot about our society and about our industry. The first thing is it's not like news to anyone. I think we've reached a level of polarization in this country that we're getting to the point where we're like incapable of solving real problems. And on autism, I do think there's my personal opinion, and I don't think this is like a crazy, uneducated opinion. Do think there's something going on here. Like, I don't think it's just a case of it's being diagnosed more, like a lot of people argue. I respect that argument, but I also respectfully disagree with it. And so, with that viewpoint, I think it's a good thing that there's like a big effort to take a close look at it and say, what's going on here? And is there something that we can do about this? And I also think that regardless of who's in power, that the White House and the United States are the only place that can focus attention and really solve problems like that historically. So I think this is, regardless of what you think about who's sitting in the White House today, I think that an initiative like this is a good thing. And I think the only place where it can really get the attention and focus and money and all that it deserves, if done the right way, is from like the leadership in the United States. So like, I have no idea what. I don't think we know. Clearly, we don't know what causes or what causes this. And it's clearly multifactorial. Does Tylenol play a role in this? I have no idea. I you know, it. I think that to believe that any medicine, the effect of any medicine on a baby that's forming in the womb is 100% benign is not a smart approach to take to anything either. So you can hate on like President Trump and his the way they do this, and like his delivery of it is, so terrible and so amateurish. Like, I get it, but there is a chance that there is a kernel of truth in this, and I it may not be a bad thing for our society to say the risk of this is not zero, and more
Hey,
people
hey,
need.
Brad,
Yeah.
can I chime in for like a
Yes.
second?
Yes.
I get your point. I just think like the challenge with giving like any medical advice in something that is tremendously nuanced without nuance is that it like terrifies people, right? And like in the context of pregnancy, right? Tylenol is often used to treat fever. Well, you know what fever is harmful for? Neural tube formation. So it's really, and you can't take ibuprofen, right? Because ibuprofen is actually more clearly contraindicated and more clearly problematic. So I think the challenge with stuff like this is whether you agree with it or not, or I'm with you, Brad. I mean, I think like assuming all medications are benign. I mean, that's silly too to just believe everything on that side, but I feel like things like this just cause a lot of anxiety and confusion. And it's not clear to me that we're going to see any sort of benefit on societal outcomes from it, right?
Yeah,
I
Paul, I mean,
agree that the delivery
could be better.
is done in a way that does not is totally counterproductive. Like, so I'm not defending that, but I just think that just allowing this to be an issue that's like, I think it's a good thing to focus on this, and I think it's a good thing to even though the messenger and the way he delivered it was not ideal. I My guess is that this is used a lot the right way, but my guess is it's probably used a lot more casually than it should be, thinking that it's totally benign. And so I think that a message like this is
You
not
know,
totally unconstructive.
Let's
And
let
I wasn't commenting on, just to be clear, like I actually think RFK Jr. has good intent. You're right. It'd be great to take on autism and figure out how to control it or remedy it. That's what we get up every day as biotechnology participants and try and do. But Brad, my concern is not the messaging, it's the process. It's the fact that this is not a scientific process, that these are preordained conclusions coming from non-scientists based on a non-scientific reading of the literature, right? When you start trying to answer a scientific problem, you start with a valid hypothesis, something that's plausible. You empirically drive experimentation to determine whether the hypothesis is correct, and then you draw conclusions not based on causation. Sorry, not based on correlation, but likely causation. And none of that's being happened. None of that is being followed here. So I think we're, at risk of really losing our sense of
uh,
of, of what is
well, well,
we're
off
up
of
we're
that,
up against the
so
hour though, folks. I
yeah,
just
let
want
me
to
just. This
go
is
on.
really important. I just want to say this. It's like super important. I want to touch on my second point because I don't totally agree. Obviously, I agree with you about the scientific process, Eric. And my second point that I think is important to be said, and for us as an industry to consider, is I think that the way that Kenvue, and in my opinion, J&J handled this or did not handle this is a huge disservice to our industry and to science. Um, our industry is the most hated industry that exists. Like the Gallup polling, the favorability rating of our industry is somewhere around 18 to 20% every year. It's the lowest industry, it's lower than Congress. There's nothing that polls less in terms of favorability and likability than our industry. And this is a great example, in my opinion, of partly why that is. So Kenvue put out a statement, which is in this day and age, is like having no answer whatsoever. It like when such an inflammatory accusation is made about your product, especially in this case where half the country thinks it's literally lunacy, like why, like they should be out, like the CEO of the company, in this case it's a consumer products company, like the CEO is like an interim guy who has like a consumer background from J&J, so maybe he's not the right messenger. But the thing that really bothers me is clearly the lawyers of this company, and J&J too, which this is really J&J's product. I know they don't own it anymore. I know they're not owners of Kenvue, but like this is a J&J product. And clearly both companies, their lawyers were like, we should say as little as possible about this to, dampen our legal liability about it. And in the process, they're letting everyone else speak on the science of this in both directions. And the public is totally confused. So like Eric, you were like, the people on TV did a great job and all this. Like, I think you're coming to that view based off of your own opinion of it. I think if you asked a random person on the street who doesn't know a lot about science or medicine, I don't think they would say, yeah, I turned on the news and like it's clear that like, this is what's going on with that. I think that the public is thoroughly confused about this. And by not putting up any defense of its own product, I think that Kenvue and J&J are basically illicit in allowing the unclear, ambiguous, like the conspiracy theories on this live, and also just not like, imagine any other industry. If you said like Cheerios cause autism, imagine any other industry that like the CEO wouldn't be on the TV the next day saying, these are the facts of this. Like, here's what you need to know, public, about our product. Like there's no other industry where the CEO of the company would not have an all-out media blitz to make the record straight on this. And these two companies not only didn't do that, but they just amplified the unclarity on this. And
Well, we
I think
started.
it's one of the reasons why people hate our industry.
I want to end where we started, where our sector is in a. I don't want to say it's on fire. It's doing really well. There are companies developing real medicines, which will have side effects for people with real disease. And I also want to end of making sure that, it's been an exciting conversation, four of the best out there to talk through these things. I want to also remind people, there is a risk that we stigmatize autism here. There are many people with many various neurodiversities. And I think that's part of the beauty of life that we must celebrate, not stigmatized. So let's hope that is not going to happen, and that is not going to be the result of all these conversations. And I think we don't have enough time to go around and get final views about anything exciting. I'm sure we'll pick up on a whole bunch of stuff next week. Our sector is in a place where we're getting so much stuff to talk about that I have another whole list here. So I want to thank everybody for joining today.